You need, in the snow, you need sunglasses.
Yeah.
I'm going to squint if I do that. So I'll be better off with them on, won't I?
You see him, Dave?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tell me when you're ready. All right, we're at the grave of Captain Harb King and his sons, and actually Harb King Jr., and that is his correct name. I have looked at source documents. His name is Harbert, Harbert King, and his father was Harbert King Sr., and his family had lived in Lincoln County for a great while. And I want to tell briefly about the story of brother against brother that involved Harb King and his brother John King, whom everybody called Jack. Harb King, at the start of the Civil War, became captain in the 3rd Kentucky Union Infantry, which was organized, as you can look over my right shoulder, at a point called Crew's Knob. There is an account, that historical account by John Tuttle that talks about coming to join the army there. Shortly after and it's kind of hard to tell his story without mentioning his lieutenant, a young man by the name of James Bridgewater, and his brothers Ogden and John Bridgewater. After a while, for whatever reason, Harb King resigned from the Union Army, but he continued to be very active against the Confederate cause. And in the summer of 1862, a man who rode with John Hunt Morgan by the name of George Lightning Ellsworth decided he was going to capture Captain King, and he borrowed a horse and saddle from a German mercenary that rode with Morgan and lost it. Captain King shot him to pieces. He managed to escape, but he lost a bag of gold and the horse. And in fact, Basil Duke, in his History of Morgan's Cavalry, says that he was excited like a volcano. He had to keep them apart. But that was in the summer of 1862. And if you know about the Civil War, after that, in the fall of 1862, there was the great Confederate invasion of Kentucky. They were hoping when they came into Kentucky that Kentuckians were going to swell the ranks of the Confederate Army, and that didn't quite happen. But they were very encouraged when the Confederates under John Hunt Morgan came into Lincoln County. They had received news of the Battle of Richmond, which was one of the most decisive battles for the Confederates in the whole history of the war. And so they were very encouraged. And so the next day, this was in September of 1862, they sent, when John Hunt Morgan won the election, he sent recruiters back to this area. And when they came into this area, John King, or Jack King, actually joined the Confederate Army. And so then he instructed the men that he could help capture his brother. And so they went over to Turkey Creek and captured Harb King, his brothers, his Harb King's sons, teenage sons, and about a dozen other men from the Crab Orchard area. Now, and it's very hard to understand, there are no unbiased source documents that tell all this that happened. So you kind of have to read both sides and try to figure out the best you can. But from all I can tell is Harb King was placed in jail in Danville by this group of Confederates that Jack had joined. Another group of Confederates under Colonel Scott took them out of jail along with these 15 other men. And when they got to Laurel County, Ogden Bridgewater, who was about 6'3", over 200 pounds, who was one of the captured men. He was the older brother of Lieutenant James Bridgewater, managed to kill his guard and escape. And so I'm supposing when they got to the Cumberland River, they hanged the teenage sons and about a dozen other young men from this area. They hung them while Captain King was forced to watch. When this happened, his brother, William Mason King, when he found out about it, he went to Pineville and retrieved the bodies. On the way back, he encountered some Confederate stragglers in Laurel County, and he murdered them in retaliation for his brother and his nephew's deaths. And they had nothing to do with it, but he murdered them anyway. Jack King, in the meantime, was in the Confederate cavalry, and if you know anything about it, in the summer of 1863, he was a part of John Hunt Morgan's great raid through Indiana and Ohio. their plans were to meet up with Robert E. Lee in Pennsylvania. And if you've read about that, the interesting thing is Jack King wasn't the only one who was brother against brother. He had two other soldiers in his unit who would fight their own brothers in the war. The Range brothers and the Spratt brothers would fight against each other. But they were captured before they could ever join up with Robert E. Lee at a place called Buffington Island. Jack King was sent to prison at a place called Camp Douglas on the river in Chicago, Illinois, or on the lake in Chicago, Illinois. And these men were treated, it was kind of like the Andersonville of the North. It's basically how they were treated. In fact, they were humiliated so much they didn't even have private bathroom facilities. Their bathrooms were open, and they had erected towers, and for a fee, you could climb up the tower and look over into the camp, and you could mock the Confederate prisoners while they were there. Now, it's very important to understand this time. I have copies of Dr. William Pettis's letters from Camp Douglas. He was in Jack King's unit, which was the 6th Kentucky Confederate Cavalry. And by the way, the 6th Kentucky Confederate Cavalry was organized at the Alcorn Homestead, which is on Danville Avenue in Stanford. James W. Alcorn was the adjutant for the 6th Kentucky. He came back after the war and built the house on that site in commemoration of that. But in one of his letters home, Dr. Pettis mentions the fact that Mrs. Jack King was in camp today, Jack King's wife. Now this kind of comes into play a little bit later. So Jack King spends the remainder of the Civil War in prison, basically is not involved anymore. After the war, Harb King's remaining sons are terrorized by the returning Confederates. In fact, the younger Bridgewater brother, John Bridgewater, writes a letter to federal authorities asking for help because they're saying that Harb King's sons are being teased and called sons of bushwhackers. And so things were very, very bad in Kentucky. And if you go into this Crab Orchard Cemetery that we're standing, you'll see there are a couple of African-American soldiers. This kind of plays into the post-war narrative because the slaveholders in Kentucky had been promised reparations. In other words, if you let your slave join the Union Army, you're going to be paid back for them. In fact, I have a letter from Dr. Pettis in October of 1865. Remember, a former Confederate soldier who's asking, when are we going to get paid for our slaves? He's out in Texas buying cattle, and he recognizes they likely never. So if you know anything about your Kentucky Civil War history, it was how Kentucky was treated after the war that influenced our politics greatly. Now, we don't have much about Jack after that, except the fact that at some point his wife divorced him. And one of the claims that she makes is, well, Jack abandoned me to join the Confederate Army. He abandoned his family. And Jack says, no, she was wholly supportive of it. As evidence of it, she made the trip all the way from Crab Orchard to Chicago to see me. And so they divorce. Several years after the war, in 1871, the Confederate memorial, which is to my right, there are several unknown Confederate soldiers buried there, two of which, by the way, were killed by James Bridgewater's compatriots at the same time King was captured, so it's all kind of intermingled. But when they dedicated this memorial in 1871, Mike Softly, who had fought with Jack King, was county judge, and he had declared that let anyone be accursed who would ever again stir the embers of war. Now, I would like to tell you that that meant that everyone got along, everyone heeded the judge's words, but that wasn't true at all. They almost immediately, after these Confederate soldiers were interred, brought murder charges against the man that had killed two of the Confederate soldiers. And at the same time, and it's the last evidence we have of Jack King, we don't know what happened to him. Jack King was kicked out of his Masonic lodge for unmasonic conduct. I don't think it's any coincidence that all this happened at the same time they were bringing murder charges up from 10 years hence. And so this left a great division within the King family, obviously, but I'm happy to say that a few years ago, the descendants of Jack King and Harb King got together and had a very agreeable family reunion. And in fact, you see they have restored these stones that I have here, and they're actually dedicating a stone in 2020. They're having a dedication for, they found the tombstone of Harb King Sr. out at Preachersville, and they're going to erect a monument here in his memory. So the family, despite all that they endured and went through, prison and betrayal and murder, they are united today. Does that get you?